We're going to give folks a few more minutes to join us. So everybody who's currently on, just hang in there. So Mark, I will defer to you when you want to kick this off.
Yeah, I mean, we got a couple more people jumping in, so I guess give it another minute. All right, I think that's everybody for now. I guess we can get started, Jim, if you want. Want to take the lead?
Sure. Did you want to make any opening comments or have me take that?
If you want to handle it.
Well, sure. So anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the second stakeholder advisory group meeting for the Santa Maria local roadway safety plan, and just instead of going to the PowerPoint to give presentations, because then you won't be able to see me and I won't be able to see you that well. We'll just do our introductions now. And Mark, you wanted to start us off?
Sure.
And we'll go to the consultant team and then our advisory group.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for being here. I'm Mark Mueller, Public Works for City of Santa Maria. As Jim noted, this is for the local roadway safety plan stakeholder advisory group meeting. So I'm representing the city on this project. I'm the project manager for the city. So glad everyone can make it. And if you have any comments or anything you that you think of after the meeting or whatever, you can send it to me or Jim directly. But glad you all took the time to be here today.
Okay, yeah, and I'm Jim Damkowicz. I'm the project manager for the consultant team, which includes my firm DKS, but also Kinley Horn. So I'll pass over to Daryl to introduce himself.
Great to meet you all. Yeah, Daryl DePontier with Kinley Horn. I'm assisting Jim and team with development and analysis of the safety data in Maria.
Okay, so now here's the hard part. Nobody be shy, just jump in and introduce yourselves.
I'll jump in quick then. I'm Jim Austin. I'm the fire marshal for the city of Santa Maria.
Hi, this is Dana Eady, and I'm the Planning Division Manager with City of Santa Maria.
Eric Ridio, I'm the Principal Civil Engineer over Capital and Construction Projects for the City of Santa Maria.
Hi, I'm Diane Doslick with Caltrans.
I'm Jeffrey Wheeler, a local bicycle advocate and pedestrian advocate.
Deutsch, the Executive Director of the Santa Barbara Bicycle Coalition and the Coalition for Sustainable Transportation.
I'm David Dennis. I'm also on the board of the Santa Barbara Bicycle Coalition and the Coalition for Sustainable Transportation, and a resident here in Santa Maria.
Ken Dahman, I'm the Santa Maria Bike Shop Manager for SB Bike and Coast as well.
Lori Tamura on Urban Planning Concepts, on the Chamber Board and HBA.
Rob Himoto, Santa Maria Valley Railroad.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, we have a good group. It's good to see. And just so everybody's aware, we are recording this meeting. If anyone has an issue with that, please let me know. Now, the idea would be we could put this on the website for others to view who were not able to make it to the meeting today. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to have a presentation, but I'd rather this not be a monologue. It's easy to get into that mode when we're doing things virtual. It's not ideal, but we'll try to get through the presentation, but we do want this to be interactive. We do want to entertain questions as we go along. So there's various ways you can do that. You can simply interrupt, which is okay. We have a small enough group, but you do have the chat box function that Mark will be keeping his eye on, and we can address those questions as they come up. And so with that, I'll just go ahead and share my screen. The host has disabled participant screen sharing. I don't know what that means. I know that Kindle, that's interesting.
She might have to allow you to share.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Kendall should be able to make you a co-host, and then you should be able to.
Yep.
There she is. The woman behind the curtain. Kendall is with DKS, and she led our public outreach effort for the plan.
Give me just a second here. Okay, Jim Demkovich. Jim, you are now the host. I bestow upon you all.
I am not worthy.
And usefulness.
She dubbed the host.
Yeah.
I'll hang in the background to make sure everything works.
Okay. Well, let me know when you can see the opening slide.
You have to put share content. Have you done that? There you go.
There we go.
Okay. Great. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and get started. Again, this is our second meeting, and if you, how many folks real quick attended the first Stakeholder Advisory Committee meeting? Yeah, there's a number of familiar faces and names. Great. If you weren't able to participate in that first one. We're super happy you're attending this one. Today's agenda, we've done introductions, so that's done. We're going to go over briefly just project goals to refresh everyone why we're doing this plan, why the city is doing this plan, and then kind of do a quick overview of how we got here today. And then we will go over some key components of the draft local roadway safety plan report, which it is on the project website, among other project deliverables. And then we'll talk about implementation. And that's really when people get excited. And there is a real implementation phase to this plan. And Daryl is going to be talking more about that when in item 5. So with that, we'll hop over to project goals. And so, obviously the plan is in draft form, and really the goal of this plan is to be a proactive safety approach. The traditional way of dealing with safety has typically been reactive. So you look at your hot spots and you react to those, but there is more of a drive by the state to be proactive. And what does that mean? That's taking a more systemic approach to safety, and that's looking at risk, that's looking at infrastructure characteristics that tend to result in collisions in various locations of the city, but those same characteristics are everywhere, or in certain other locations that may not have the collision history to indicate a potential concern. And so that's where the proactive side comes in, and we'll be talking more about that under implementation. Another goal is to identify and prioritize low-cost safety improvements that address what we see in our analysis. And then last but not least, to provide a future resource for getting funding. And that's really a big part of this. And there's multiple funding sources out there. Daryl's going to talk about them later. But the one funding source that is probably the most obvious is the Highway Safety Improvement Program, otherwise known as HSIP. And that new cycle 11, will be coming around this April. So there was a strong emphasis to get this plan developed and get it adopted by the city, because it's a prerequisite to getting HSIP funds. You have to have an adopted local roadway safety plan. And what is a local roadway safety plan? It's basically an expansion of what was previously funded through this program by Caltrans, which focused on the engineering side of things. The local roadway safety plan approach is broader. It incorporates education, enforcement, and emergency response. So it's a little bit more holistic than what has been done in the past. And I would say, Diane can probably speak to this, but there's a 5th E now, and it's called emerging technologies. And we're going to try to shoehorn that into this plan. It's still a draft, but we definitely want to recognize that there is now a 5th E out there that we should be thinking about. So project overview and status, and I'll try to be quick here. So the LRSP development process starts at a very high level. We do have a vision statement. You develop the vision statement. You look at emphasis areas, and these aren't physical locations. These are just, is it pedestrians that seem to be having a lot of the collisions and higher collision rates, pedestrian crossings at intersections, or is it uncontrolled crossings in corridors or roadways? Is it bicyclists? Is it enforcement? Is it just impaired drivers or distracted drivers? So these are the emphasis areas that really provide the focus. And once we have those emphasis areas, we make a goal statement. And this really needs to be quantifiable and can be tracked. And we have developed goal statements for our emphasis areas. And then that gets into the strategies and the more specific, well, what are the action items that we can do, the actionable things that we can do to remedy these issues. And that's when you get into your low cost countermeasures. and otherwise known as your improvements.
So Jim, we had a comment. Why do we only want low-cost interventions?
Well, the good news on the safety front is a lot of improvements are low cost, relatively speaking. In the transportation planning and funding world, infrastructure improvements can get very, very expensive. So the low cost countermeasure is that you're trying to be as cost effective as possible by addressing the safety issue or concern, but applying the most effective and cost effective improvements. That's my take on it. And relatively speaking, those are lower cost infrastructure treatments than what is typically handled by a transportation planning firm who are implementing infrastructure improvements.
There's also the fact that one of the evaluation criteria for many grant programs, including HSIP, is that you have implemented some low cost, what they call incremental interventions before necessarily applying for a big ticket item anyway. So there are expensive things that are probably needed to address safety, but we want to make sure we've done what we can with those lower cost measures first, so we know where to prioritize those bigger investments.
Okay, and so for our vision statement, this was talked about at the previous meeting, but the vision statement that the city is preferring is I'll quote, to progressively reduce fatal and severe injury crashes in Santa Maria. And keep in mind that the focus of a local roadway safety plan is on the fatal and severe injury crashes. That is the primary focus. Our goals, which are quantifiable and achievable, those are two very important characteristics of our goal statements, is to reduce below statewide average by facility type. And that could be by intersection or by segment or by user, ped and bike, so on and so forth. So the state has statewide averages, they track all this stuff. For many of these things, the city is not tracking well relative to the state. In other words, within the city of Santa Maria, they're above the statewide average for many of these performance measures that are tracked by the state. So we feel it's very quantifiable, easy to do, and achievable to get the city of Santa Maria below those statewide averages. So those are, in general, our vision statement and our goals. In terms of interim deliverables, there is a collision analysis technical memorandum, a components memorandum, which is just another way of saying identifying emphasis areas, and then our strategy memorandum. Those three technical documents more or less provided the building blocks for our draft plan. I'm just pointing them out because they are available on the project website if you wanted to take a peek at those. So our overview and status, big picture, back in August, we began before August, but we completed our collision data analysis in August. It's important to note that this plan is just a snapshot. We looked at roughly 8 years of data, SWTR's data from January 2013 to July 2021. And we were also assisted by the Santa Maria Police Department through their processing using Crossroads, which is a data software to process SWTR's data. And we had that for a snapshot between January 2015 and July 2021. In the report, we show both. In the SWTR's data, there was some missing information that you get when you're pulling that data raw. That's why the city of Santa Maria Police Department put a lot of time into processing that data. Primary collision factor was one of the key things that there was a lot of NAs associated with the SWTR's data. So we were able to remedy that by digging into the Santa Maria Crossroads data. So kudos to the city's police department for helping out. In terms of, in September, we looked at the draft components, which was the vision statement, the goal statements, and the emphasis areas. In October of this year, we did, or I guess last year, we did the countermeasure development and developed a list in December. And here we are in January, we have our draft plan. And That's going to ostensibly get in front of the city council sometime in March, and I'll defer to Mark to discuss the details of that.
Yeah, we're targeting the second meeting in March, which would be the March 15th meeting. So if you have any comments on the draft LRSP, especially after this meeting, written or verbal, either way, you can get those to me. And we'd like to implement those before the meeting so that they can adopt a finalized document. And I think we're looking for comments probably mid-February. So probably February 11th at the latest would be my preference. So that gives you a couple weeks.
Yeah, and this thing hanging over here to the bottom right. So that's kind of a main external deadline, and that's the HSIP application process, which typically we're expecting will begin in April. So we definitely need that March approval so we can show that we're eligible to even go after HSIP funds, some of the components of the plan. So I do want to talk about outreach real quick. We did have a very strong outreach effort, which is required for an LRSP. And we had a public engagement plan, which was basically the blueprint for which the consultant team in the city went after or implemented our outreach efforts. We had a frequently asked questions, which is on the website. We did project branding, and that's very important. And our main branding, you can see it on practically every side. Safer Streets for Santa Maria. That's really the name of the plan internally. And so we have very unique branding. We did have a project website where a lot of the project materials as they were developed were included, and project information for folks who wanted to know what it was all about. Here's the URL for the website if you don't have it. And it's pretty easy, just www.saferstreetsforsantamaria.com. We also had a community survey, and very happy to say that we had nearly 500 surveys completed. That was a huge effort, and as part of the active transportation that I was affiliated with, that was concluded in 2020, that had roughly a little over 300 surveys for that effort. So that was a goal of mine. I wanted to do better than that. And I'm really happy that we were able to do that. We had some community engagement activities, pop-up events. So instead of having the public come to us, through a public workshop or what have you, I find it's much more effective to go where the public is and do that legwork. And so we did do 2 pop-up events, which I'll talk about in a second, but by going out to where the public was, we got 443 surveys completed. 55 surveys were completed online using the website. So that just gives you an indication how important it is to get people on the ground and talking with folks where they meet, not where we want them to meet with us. And then, of course, it's you guys, the Stakeholder Advisory Group, which we have engaged and continue to hope to get your good ideas and comments. So again, just the more obvious things, obviously everything was bilingual in terms of public outreach. I was happy to use the County of Santa Barbara resources through getting promotores assistance. Promotores are folks who can speak. Obviously, they're bilingual, but they can also interact very comfortably with the Mexican community. And so they were a big help in our public outreach efforts. And the pop-up events were the Elk Rodeo event over Labor Day weekend, the Cruisin' Nationals event, and then concurrently with the Cruisin' Nationals, there was also the Farmers Market that was adjacent to that event. So those were the 3 things that we really targeted in terms of our outreach. In addition, we had e-newsletters, virtual workshops. That's why we're recording this meeting. We'd like to put that on the website for folks to view. And then the consultant team collaborated with the city's public information officer to make sure that the city's website and our project website were linked and shared information. So real quick, I just want to talk about the two events. So the Elk Rodeo, we had 226 surveys completed, 138 on Saturday, which was the street fair, and then another 88 during the rodeo. 42% of the surveys were completed in Spanish, 58% in English. And keep in mind, as part of the survey itself, we do ask what your ethnicity is and background, and that information showed roughly about a 65-70% Spanish. Why you see the percentages differ here is that a lot of bilingual folks just chose to do the survey in English, even though they were fluent in Spanish. And that, interestingly, was primarily the younger Hispanic community who were very familiar and comfortable with English. They just did it for English, in English, maybe for us, I don't know. So the next event was the Cruisin' Nationals, and that another 217 were completed there. 114 on the Cruisin' Nationals event, and then on Sunday we went to the Farmers Market, which was right next adjacent to the Cruisin' Nationals. This one, it was much more heavily on the Spanish speaking side. So 75% of the surveys were completed in Spanish, 25% in English. So if you combine the two, it's roughly that 65% or so that folks filled out the survey. So it's kind of a good cross check, I would say, that we're getting a good representation of the city of Santa Maria in our survey. So here's our draft plan, and I'll just kind of go through some of the highlights. So we are, as Mark said, we're looking for your feedback and comments, and you can do that on the website, or you can contact Mark through email, probably is preferred because it's in writing. You can also contact Kendall Flint, who allowed me to be the host of this PowerPoint. This is her email address. And at the end of this presentation, I should have put my email address here as well, but I would say myself, Kendall or Mark, you can provide your comments or post them on the website.
Jim, speaking of which, you want to pause and see if there's a couple chat comments and see if there's anyone that wants to vocalize their comments as well.
Oh.
So a lot of comments on the vision statement, suggestions to change it to proactively instead of, or changing proactively instead of progressively reducing serious and fatal collisions. Also, Jeffrey's asking if it's possible to change to a Vision Zero concept, implementing Vision Zero as part of the vision statement. Yeah, so I see that Heather has her hand up. So if you want to.
Okay, should I just kind of run through these
If you'd like
comments
to.
that are in the chat box?
Yeah.
So we talked about investments. So I hope that we satisfied those comments, and we're not dismissing larger investments. In fact, I would say, depending on how successful we are in getting state funds for some of these improvements, we can actually get quite a dollar amount to implement improvements. I think the idea, and this was what Darrell was referring to, it's good to identify improvements that are applicable to many locations, and that's the systemic approach. And Caltrans and the state actually prefer that approach because I think it's more effective than versus focusing on a specific location where, even though that may indicate a hot spot, you're throwing all your money at one location versus throughout the system. So there's definitely an advantage to that. So yeah, fatal and injury. So is it possible to draft a vision statement? Okay, Vision Zero. So there's Vision Zero plans. There's also systemic safety plans, but the latest permutation of that is the local roadway safety plans. But if you have any one of those three, you are eligible for HSIP. And I will say Vision Zero plans, in terms of the goals as well as the vision statement, you know, what I know, and Mark can chime in on this, or anyone from the city, Vision Zero is a vision. And I think the city felt that the plan would be much more tangible and real. There was actual some goals that could be quantified and achieved as time goes on. So Vision Zero is very aspirational. And this was a big discussion at the first stakeholder advisory group. So if you missed that, this was all pretty much fleshed out as part of that meeting, that everyone was more or less in concurrence that a Vision Zero being great, but it is aspirational and much more difficult to achieve. And the city just didn't want to set themselves up to look like they failed, even though that's a very noble goal. Having achievable goals was considered a better approach. But and Mark, I don't know if you have anything you'd like.
Yeah, just to chime in on that, I think the reason why everyone's here today is because they are focused on safety and they're concerned about safety, and the idea and hope for everyone is, you know, everyone wants to go home at the end of the day. And I think, you know, aspirationally, we do want to get to zero collisions. But, you know, in order to get to zero, you first have to get under, you know, below state averages. So, you know, on the way to zero, we got to get other steps. So, you know, this is we're hoping this document gets updated and as a living document, we can show improvement and progress. So it's not that zero isn't the goal. It's you know, we're taking steps to get there, and it's not yeah, like Jim was saying, we don't want to look, we also have to keep politics and optics in mind. How is this going to be perceived? You know, we have to present this to city council. You know, are they going to approve a document that says, you know, it's a Vision Zero document? They may not, you know, we got to sell this as well. You know, it's a safety document, and we, you know, they may not want to tie their name to something that could fail. So it's a softball to them, say, hey, look, you're doing something, and it helps us to get money so we can get to that zero. So it's not that we're dismissing Vision Zero. A lot of the ideas moving towards a safer roadway network are shown in this plan, and it's kind of our way forward.
If I can just interject one little thing as well. At the statewide level, the same conversation is happening in terms of how Caltrans is approaching the strategic highway safety plan. And it's just a well-recognized thing, as everybody said, so that we're not sidestepping Vision Zero. I think the long-term vision is that the LRSP is a first step towards that, because one of the key components of Vision Zero strategy is having that real understanding of what investments, what types of countermeasures, what are the most effective things locally. And that's what this is doing, is it's establishing that toolbox. It's giving us the means to monitor the impact of what we're developing. And once we have that down and we can directly link the level of investment we're doing to actual observed safety impact results, then we can actually develop that achievable Vision Zero strategy, because we know what is needed to do.
Heather, you want to chime in?
Well, and I was just going to point out that Daryl's been good about responding to the questions as they come in. So please take a look at those as well. So I think that addresses the comments. And we had a
couple hands up. I think Heather was first.
Okay, I'll go ahead. A couple of sort of questions, comments, and I'm really excited to see this plan focused on pedestrian bicycle safety. They don't always, and I think you've really touched on, you know, many of the issues that we have in Santa Maria. And I really appreciate how much you've done in terms of outreach and really connecting with the community. So that is really to be applauded. One thing I noticed with the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, in the report, there's a lot of groups listed, and these are all really important groups to have at the table. At the Stakeholder Advisory Committee meetings, on the other hand, there's just the handful of us. So you might want to reach out and say, hey, you actually weren't a participant, you were invited, but that's different than them being able to participate and, adjust the stakeholder advisory committee, maybe say these people were invited, but I think we need to recognize they weren't actually at the table. The second is a comment that it has a lot of components to it, and it has to do with pedestrians and crossings. So looking at sort of starting around page 34 and how you address sort of pedestrians and crossings, one of the things that we have found in the outreach that we've been doing is that probably 99% of adults in our community do not know that intersecting streets create a crosswalk and that pedestrians have the right of way and the drivers must yield. So in terms of very, very low cost interventions, just educating drivers that they're supposed to yield anytime there's a crossing. And I know, I grew up in Santa Maria, my mom still lives there, and it's very difficult for her to leave her house by foot because she can't get across the intersections. And these are just, residential neighborhood intersections. So the next step would be then marking those intersections. And I know many cities in California don't have policies where all intersections are marked or all, corners of the intersections. So that's another thing where if you just mark one leg and the other three are not marked and people don't understand they're supposed to stop anyway, it just creates additional confusion. So what I see in the report is it highlights the use of very expensive RFPs and things like that. And so I'd like us to consider some really cheap first steps. Hey, did you know you're actually supposed to yield to a pedestrian? Hey, let's just mark each corner of this intersection in places where we have low volumes and low speeds, etc. And that kind of gets to a data issue. When we talk about the number of people who are crossing not in a crosswalk, we know just from numerous reports that, the police and where this data is coming from, they don't actually know that an unmarked crosswalk is a crosswalk and that pedestrians have the legal right of way. So if you're crossing at a legal crosswalk, but it's not marked, that is very often sort of highlighted being crossing illegally or something like that. So I think we should just have a sort of note that says, hey, this is the data that was gathered, but it was gathered by people who don't necessarily know what a crosswalk is. And then my third comment, this one's very quick. I noticed you've really highlighted Broadway. Broadway is owned by Caltrans. Caltrans is spending a lot of money completely, repaving, resurfacing Broadway. Talk about a cheap, easy way to get crosswalks marked, et cetera, et cetera. And we have been trying to figure out what their plans are. We've basically been told that we won't know what they're going to do until after they have their final plans. And then, of course, that'll be done. So we're just wondering if you're coordinating with them and if there's any way that the community can be involved in what's happening there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll try to briefly respond to your three statements, but they're all very good. So in terms of the stakeholder advisory group, the whole group gets sent the e-blast and the information. So even though, not everyone attends these physical, in this case, virtual meetings, they are getting all the information. They are provided all the same materials that the folks that are here at this meeting do. So, but we can make a distinction in the plan regarding the level of physical participation in our stakeholder advisory group meetings. Good points on pedestrians and crossings. And it kind of rung a bell. I kind of skipped over one of the last outreach slide, but that I'll touch on. But we'll definitely do that. And then I agree with you regarding the unmarked crossings. Just because there isn't striping there, it doesn't mean that motorists, they must yield to pedestrians across the board. So That gets into education and also enforcement, which we do talk about. And then last but not least, you're absolutely correct about Broadway. We'll get into the hotspot locations because we thought that would be of interest, but we do highlight which facilities are within the Caltrans right of way. That will require coordination, in close coordination with Caltrans for any improvements that might be considered and desired within the state right of way. So we'll hit on those a little bit later. All good comments.
Yeah, there's just a quick comment on the Broadway resurfacing. Excuse me. I know that the project's currently underway there. It's under construction now. Some of the curb ramps on the south side of Santa Maria and are being demoed and will be reconstructed. And then the resurfacing should be happening this spring, summer. So in terms of changing the striping or adding crosswalks, I don't know all the details on that. I guess, Dan, do you have, would you happen to know if they're adding any new crosswalks? I don't think they're adding any new crosswalks, like at unsignalized intersections, or I know that they're adding
Just
bike lanes. where possible.
marking the crosswalks. I don't
Right.
think we're asking for new sort of mid-block crossings, but just marking existing crosswalks. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Marcus and Diane. Yeah, I'm not aware of any new marked crosswalks that this project is including, except that we have a separate project at Bunny that's installing a signal. So there will be a crossing there that wasn't there before that will be signalized.
What intersection is that, Diane? Do you know?
Bunny and Broadway. It's a separate project from the paving project, but that one I believe is very close to being under construction as well.
Diane, could you also speak to one of the things that I've noticed is that Caltrans still use diagonal curb ramps, and I mean it's been out there for a while, but we think in the next month or so it'll be officially adopted. The ProReg standard of having perpendicular curb ramps, which just makes it much safer for pedestrians because you're being directed directly into the crosswalk and there's higher visibility. Do you know if Caltrans is redoing those curb ramps to meet those new standards or not? So will there be two ramps per corner or just one?
Yeah, I understand your question, and I do not know what if they're putting those in with this project or not. But I know they are upgrading some of the curb ramps, but I can't say for certain if it's the directional ramps or the one in the center.
Do you know if it's possible for the community to find out?
I can probably
yeah,
help with that. This is Eric with
Thanks,
the city. Yeah, the design for that CAP-M project with those curb ramps was done, it's been a couple of years, so construction is just starting. So I would assume, well, we can get the plans for you, but in my review, it looked like they were standard, previous standard curb ramps. So I don't think there's any new standards that have been incorporated into that design.
Not to derail the conversation, but these standards have been around for 14 years, so they're not exactly new. But if there's the opportunity to make some adjustments, so they don't have to be replaced, 2 months from now, that would be great.
I understand. There's a lot to going into the design of curb ramps, and there's a lot of hardware at an intersection and trying to, and sometimes it's hard enough to fit one ramp in, let alone two, with everything that is going on at a corner. But no, yeah, we're aware of those standards and the purpose of them. So thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna just backtrack because unfortunately I skipped a slide. This is the last outreach slide. It kind of provides a summary. And I know in our first stakeholder advisory group meeting, we went through from the amount of surveys that were done at that point, all the results. But these are in general what we're seeing from the public. And good news in terms of who took the survey, a good mix of ages and geographic coverage. We did ask what portions of the city do they live and work. So we had a really good cross section. The top concerns, the two top concerns are pedestrian and bike, both in terms of where they see the most need is in terms of improvements. And then these are the two modes that they're more likely to not use because of safety concerns. So that was a pretty dominant theme from what we heard. Improvement types that most folks could support were obviously bike lanes and sidewalks that kind of speak to their top concerns, protected sidewalks or crosswalks, and then street lighting. So those were and there were others, but these were the things that kind of gravitated to the top. What were the improvement types least supported, or what they would rather not support, was speed bumps and speed cameras, reducing speed limits and truck prohibitions. And I do want to state that through SB 42, and we're going to include some information in this in the draft. It's currently not in there now, but starting January 1st, the process and methodology for changing speed limits has been changed. It's a huge paradigm shift. Whereas before, if a jurisdiction, in this case, the city of Santa Maria or Caltrans, wanted to see if they could lower the speed limits, they would have to do a speed survey and look at the 85th percentile speed. So it was based on prevailing conditions of how motorists were using the facility at the time. And a lot of jurisdictions are afraid to do these studies because a lot of times it requires them to increase the speed limits versus what they would rather like to do, and that's decrease them. So that's been thrown out. And so now jurisdictions, local jurisdictions like the city of Santa Maria, as well as Caltrans, now have much more latitude in revising speed limits, basically lowering them. So that's kind of a arrow in the quiver that we didn't have before. So just something to keep in mind, although reducing speed limits is kind of ironic. A lot of folks would not support that. In terms of where they would like to see law enforcement. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Jim, this is Diane again with Caltrans.
Sure.
You know, I've been reading that SB or AB 43, and I'm not convinced that Caltrans has the same ability and authority granted in that bill as the local agency does to reduce speed limits. So they are going to be drafting revisions to the California MUTCD to try to, they've been working on trying to interpret the, you know, what the legislators wanted, what's allowed in there, and there'll be draft revisions that are going to be presented to the CTCDC, I believe, in February, so pretty soon. So we'll have a better understanding of what our abilities are in that case. But I don't want anybody leaving this meeting today thinking that we can lower the speed limit on Broadway and Main Street, because I'm not convinced that we can yet. So thanks.
Could you share that? Is there going to be a staff report or background information prepared for the CTC on that?
Yeah. Usually my experience with the CTCDC is that those things come out, you know, just a few days before, probably like, you know, your typical city council meetings, you know, 72 hours or whatever. So yeah, you're just gonna have to check back on their website and see when it gets posted. And I believe the meeting, I think, is maybe the first week in February.
Well, that's great information. And it makes sense. I can see the state having their hands tied a bit more than a local agency. So we'll be keeping our eye on that. Are folks typically excited about that, Diane, or is it
what was your question?
new law that? I was just curious how Caltrans internally feels about the legislation.
I don't know. I haven't spoke with anybody, you know, in headquarters about it. I mean, personally, I think it's a great, you know, lowering speed limits is you know, it's been shown that the lower the speed limit is, the less likely you're going to have a serious or fatal injury. So we are obviously in support of lowering speed limits and keeping them lower. I think it's a good start. I myself, will, like I said, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But I myself was disappointed in that it did not seem to address these state highways that run through these communities like this. I'm hoping that their interpretation is different than what my first read. But I thought there maybe could have been more done with the bill. But you know, that's the state legislature, and we don't have control over that. So.
Sure. And then Lori's had her hand up for a minute. Lori, you want to chime in?
Yes, thank you. I don't want to interrupt because I think you are still finishing up your presentation, so I can wait if you want to finish that.
Well, yeah, real quick. Just the public in terms of what they would like to see law enforcement focus on. And now you see it right there, it's distracted and impaired drivers, focus on speed limit enforcement. And yet that's a bit ironic because for the most part, the public wouldn't support speed bumps or speed cameras or reducing speed limits, but they want the enforcement part of that. And also focus on red light enforcement. So there was a lot of concern over red light infractions. So anyway, go ahead, Lori.
Oh, okay, thank you. Again, Lori Tamura, I'm very much interested in this, read through the document, had a couple of just quick comments. One of them was that it seems, and again, as far as engagement goes, there's some organizations that I didn't see on this list and wanted to throw them out. One of them in the past, when we had the Chamber's Transportation Committee, you know, there were a number of people, including Rob has been on the committee before, but AAA was really involved in getting information out to our group and to the chamber in the past. They have quite a bit of safety information. They also have, I believe they still have the DMV counter there that they can do registration and stuff. And I would suggest reaching out to AAA. For Santa Maria, they seem to be a good resource for information. And the same thing with DMV. I mean, it seems like they should be also involved in this discussion from a state level, because they're the one issuing, you know, licenses, and I'm sure they have some information about safety. But you know, some of these organizations, I think, would add some insight into this report. And of course, then the chamber and even local civil engineers that are involved in designing these things might be helpful to be at least approached and included in the discussion. I mean, you have a lot of, you know, community organizations, but you don't have those that actually are in this every single day involved, at least not listed in this document. So I have two other comments. One of them is in regards to a statement on page, oh shoot, did I lose my mind? It said something like, I just had it marked. Anyways, oh, here it is on page 12. Last line, it says a significant increase in overall severity of bike and pedestrian involved collisions, particularly for fatal and severe injury collisions. And yet what is that metric? What is that statement based on? Because you have a time frame of 2013 to 2021, and you don't have anything from, I would say, 2003 to 2013 to mark that metric against. Or you don't see a trend like from 2013, 14, 15, 16 to 20. So how is that statement validated? And, you know, I never want to say that, you know, a total of 22 fatalities over 10 years is, each one of those is a hardship, and even on some of these other injuries and these statistics, but is Santa Maria over the last 30 years safer than it was 30 years ago? Or are we just so focused on just the last 10 years? And is it getting worse? Is it getting better? I don't necessarily support that statement as it's written, because I don't see the validation in this report to say that.
Yeah, and I'll respond to that. That's a very good question. Yeah, so unfortunately, we are just taking our snapshot. So we have 7 years, and I think that statement was based on how that trend, or how was it trending within those 7 years. So
Jim, I think
that out, and we can clarify that.
I think it's actually just miswritten. It's using the wrong verb. What it was meaning was that the bicycle and pedestrians have a worse fatal and severe outcome than the non-bike ped crashes. And that's what the figure that it's referencing is showing. So it's not a temporal increase, it's a modal increase. And it just needs to be rewritten a little bit to better describe that. So thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, I didn't, again, you heard what I said, and it didn't seem to reflect the information provided. And then the last thing, and I don't want to make this sound, because I love Santa Maria, I love this community, but when I look at the table on 8 that talks about walking and biking, I know that the way the question was, worded, it talked about, safety in the lines of traffic, but I think I almost think that question should have been tempered with, do you feel safe from a crime perspective? Because a lot of people won't walk or bike in the late evenings, or, in the, twilight, or, there's other factors about walking and biking in the town rather than just sidewalks and bike lanes. And so I think that might have skewed these numbers if you didn't have a actual physical safety or crime related safety question along with that.
No,
Lori, a quick question as to what you're referencing. If it's the page, it's asking about children. We do a lot of work with children getting to and from school, and it's not something that's happening during the evening. So I can see if it was a general question, but if we're just talking about children walking and biking to school, I think it's a little different.
Well, I would say that answer is exactly the same answer. Most people will not send their kids to school walking because of safety. And that is, interaction, just what's out there right now.
Laura, I'll just add, it's a legitimate comment and concern, and I appreciate it. However, I mean, we were trying to control for that factor and not have it reflected in the responses. This is a local roadway safety plan. So really what we're trying to get after is what characteristics of the transportation system do you feel are unsafe? And I understand that there's an overall overarching crime layer that permeates everything, but we were trying to control for that as part of our questions.
I appreciate that.
It was deliberate.
I appreciate that, and I just felt like somebody had to say it.
Yep, appreciate it.
Those are my comments.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and continue, but these are great comments and suggestions, so keep them coming.
I did have one other comment, sorry.
Okay.
I was the one that made the suggestion about proactive rather than progressively. Right now, progressively is like a, I don't know, it's becoming kind of a cliche word. And, I would suggest using something that actually purports action rather than just being more progressive or more woke. So anyways, just my suggestion.
I think either could work. I think they're trying to get at the same thing that Mark wanted to see. So
Yeah, the goal with the progressively statement was actually kind of getting back to that vision zero thing, was that the goal is not going to be a fixed goal. It's going to be one that advances. So every time we achieve a goal, we set the new goal and we keep moving it forward. So I don't know if maybe we need to tweak it a little bit to make that more evident or add proactive to it. But I do think the progressive part was deliberate and does have a purpose there.
And that's a very good point. So our goals are to come under the statewide averages for like facilities. And obviously, next time we take our snapshot or track this, those statewide averages change as well. So that's kind of part of the progressiveness of the effort itself, that it's tracked over time, but our target can change too. So. Okay, well, moving on, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. This is just the components of a LRSP. There's the plan definition, the implementation side, and the plan accountability. Daryl will be focusing on that implementation and accountability aspect. So we're getting there. I will point out that the key thing here, you see our emphasis areas to the right. They include pedestrians, intersections, bicycles, impaired and distracted driving, and seniors. These were the areas that the data and what we heard from the public and from you folks are areas that need to be emphasized as part of this plan and our strategies to improve safety. But you know, the traditional hotspot analysis, it is a data-driven process, so we wanted to point out where those hotspots were. So for the hot corridors, these are our top 10. And you'll see the corridors that are shaded. Those are state facilities. So in this case, roughly 5 of the corridors are owned and operated by Caltrans. The other 5 are predominantly the city. So obviously the state right away requires coordination with Caltrans. And keep in mind, these are just absolute numbers, so they haven't been normalized using rates, and we'll get into that in a second. So here's our hot intersections, and you'll see most of them are along Broadway, and most of them are state facilities. So that's kind of a bit of a challenge, but can also be an opportunity as well. Looking at ped and bike specific, again, it's roughly a 5 to 6 split. And then for intersections, again, these are just ped and bike related collisions. A lot of issues on Broadway, which shouldn't surprise anyone. I always like to show this heat map. This was developed as part of the active transportation plan for the city. You know, the red is higher concentrations of ped and bike and vehicle conflicts and collisions. And you can just see how this pattern emerges and where the focus needs to be for ped and bike. And that's absolute terms. So we do have this critical collision rate and equivalent property damage only screens. And not to get too wonky, but the rate is the rate. So we look at how utilized a facility is relative to the number of collisions that occur there. And when you do that, some locations that don't have a lot of collisions are actually locations that aren't well traveled. And so their rates are very competitive and do indicate an issue. And so we've broken those out by facility type, and that's, you know, other principal arterial, minor arterial, major collector, local road, and then signalized intersections. We've highlighted those that are within the state right of way. And so these are very telling. And for your local critical crash rate, any value over that's not negative is considered significant. And these are the ones that float up to the top. and we provide some notes. So I won't go into each one of these, but just want you to recognize that even though we were looking at the traditional hotspot, which is just the absolute number of collisions, we do normalize using the amount of traffic, which are the rates, as well as equalizing everything equivalent to a property damage only. Because keep in mind, we're only focusing on fatal and severe injury collisions. So using societal cost factors associated with collisions that are provided by the state, we can basically make, well, how many property damage only? So only the vehicles are involved. Would that number equal? And so you kind of can compare apples to apples in terms of total collisions. And you can see some pretty significant numbers here in the signalized intersections. So what's occurring at Broadway and Stoll and Main and Blosser and Broadway and Prisker is quite significant. So here we are again. So please provide your feedback. We've already received a lot of good questions, but if you continue to have questions or comments, please provide them. And with that, we'll get into implementation, and which I think is a real key component of this. Developing those HSIP applications, and there will be 3, is part of this overall plan. So kudos to the city for setting up this project in such a way that it's not only just developing a plan and getting a plan approved, but it's actually taking that next step to submitting HSIP applications that can actually kickstart the implementation of the plan right off the bat. So with that, I'll pass it over to Daryl, and Daryl, just let me know when you want me to change slides.
All right, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. So the first slide here is, you'll probably recognize this from the report. This is showing you where all the high crash intersections are. And the reason I wanted to show this to you right now is because it's really trying to highlight that if we take an approach where we're responding to things as they occur, it's going to be a really difficult fight to win to get us to those reduced crashes. Any one location is just going to be a small proportion of what we have going on. So this gets back to that low cost systemic countermeasures. So if there's something that we've identified at these higher crash case study locations that seems to be contributing to those crashes, it's pretty likely that that condition is contributing to crashes elsewhere too. So something really simple, like just putting some retroreflective backplating on a signal head or things like that, that have been actually demonstrated to really reduce crashes, we could just do that everywhere, make that a project where we just upgrade all the signals and do that. And then we'll have a much greater impact on the number of crashes at a much lower cost than we would be with a major intersection design. That said, once we have done that and we've done some of those systemic smaller things, there's still going to be crashes. And then we can start looking at some of the more expensive types of countermeasures out there that need to be done. And we'll be able to justify those a lot more after we've said, okay, we've done these smaller interventions. We've seen how they work. They've helped, but not enough. So we need to go to the next step and do these more costly things. So the next step, or next slide, sorry. So we're going to talk about HSIP, but I also wanted to show you this. For anybody who's not familiar, this is grants.ca.gov. It's a state website, and any grant that runs through the state can be listed here. So you can type in whatever it is you want to do, and it will give you a list of all the grants that might potentially be a match, who can apply for them, how much the grant could be potentially worth, how much local funding needs to be provided to apply, when the applications need to be submitted, when they're expected. So this is a really helpful resource that's fairly new that you can use to find money, basically, to do things in a pretty good variety of ways. And there's a lot of very creative programs in there. So the next slide. There are some core funding programs that are really directly applicable. So we have the Highway Safety Improvement Program that we'll talk to in more detail, but there's also the Active Transportation Program. This plan can provide you some help in going for grants there. The Road Repair and Accountability Act is a statewide program that we're all paying into, and the city can team with SBCAG or Caltrans to go after some bigger projects that might be on some of the big corridors in the city. Office of Traffic Safety has a lot of grant programs for educational and enforcement initiatives that are also part of this plan. Sustainable Communities Program gives grants for planning activities. So maybe for some of those systemic interventions, you want to have a more focused plan on how to do that or where to focus. So that could be a funding source to those plans. And then there's a lot of discretionary and formula funding that the city has available to it that can be allocated for specific purposes, and there might be safety. And then locally, we have the Measure A sales tax. That's another resource that the city might be able to employ for some of this. So getting more specifically into HSIP, and the reason we're looking at that is because that's what's funding this program. It's got a grant program coming out pretty quickly. We're expecting it in April. It really emphasizes benefit cost for a lot of the bigger things, which is one of the reasons why low cost systemic interventions are really good, because you get a lot more benefit, which allows you to afford a much bigger grant. So even these low cost improvements can actually be quite expensive when you start talking about implementing them citywide. So this program is a great way to fund some of that stuff. It also, particularly for pedestrians and crossings and things like that, tends to have a set aside component that's less competitive. You don't have to actually have crashes or any benefit cost associated with it. And it's a little bit more first come, first serve. So if you wanted to do a pedestrian crossing or a signalized pedestrian crossing or something like that, it's a way to fund that. So the location specific versus systemic, I've explained that a little bit, but if we're trying to do one expensive improvement, we want to add a new traffic signal or something, and that's going to cost us $500,000 to do, and we only have the crashes at that one intersection that we can use as a benefit, it's going to be a lot harder to score that application really well. Whereas if we're going to do something like, let's put a new detection system in on 5 corridors in the city, and on those 5 corridors, you have 50 intersections, you have 50 intersections worth of potential benefit that you can claim, which is going to give you a much bigger amount of money you can afford when you're going after that grant. So one of the key components of the eligibility is this LRSP. So as Jim mentioned, we have some emphasis areas we've identified in this LRSP. So tying what we want to apply to the HSIP to those emphasis areas is going to be a really key item. So if you remember, that's the bicycles, the pedestrians, the distracted driving, the impaired driving, and the seniors. And I believe that was some intersection treatments. So believe it or not, those emphasis areas cover most of what HSIP covers and beyond. And so we can talk about that a little bit more on the next couple slides. So when it comes to HSIP, I don't want to necessarily go through each one of these individually because you'll all fall asleep and get a migraine, but there's a whole bunch of things that we can apply for HSIPs. This is the list of what it covers. If you look closely, you realize a lot of these categories are a little bit on the vague side, which gives us a lot of opportunity to customize what we want to do. The key things to note here, and we'll come back to this and use it as we discuss things later on, is that for each different intervention, you'll notice there's a crash type. So that's the types of crashes that you can consider when you're calculating your benefits. There's the crash reduction factor. So that's basically saying how much you would reduce crashes if you implement that. So for that first item of lighting, if you implement that, you have the potential to reduce 40% of your nighttime crashes, which can add up quite substantially if you have a lot of nighttime crashes. The expected life span, so that improvement is expected to last for 20 years, and then you'd have to basically do it over again and replace it. The HSIP funding eligibility, so you'll notice that varies across the improvements. That's telling you how much money the city has to chip in if you're going to go for that. So if it says 100%, it's fully funded, the city doesn't have to contribute anything. If it's less than 100%, the city has to make up that difference as a local match. That's important because you can actually do up to 3 of these improvements on a single application. But if you do that, you have to be careful about that eligibility because the lowest or the highest amount of maps the city has to provide applies to the entire application, regardless of what the other components have. And then there's that last one is the systemic approach. So there's a little bit of a weight given to the more systemic countermeasures. So if it's high or very high, that means this is something that you really should be looking at implementing broadly at a lot of locations, whereas the lower ones are going to be more specific at an individual location. And it tends to be a little bit harder to get those high bay overseas with those. So as you'll see, there's a few pages of that. We can use this. It's broken into signalized, unsignalized, and roadway improvements. So we'll just bounce back here when we're having our discussions. I want to go to slide 33. So we have the example emphasis areas of goals. So if you've seen in the report, each of those emphasis areas we identified has its goal. What are we trying to achieve with this in the near term? And then we have some strategies focused on the engineering, the enforcement, and the education in here. So the engineering side, that's where we're going to focus on for HSIP, because that's what that funds. For the enforcement education, that's where some of those other programs I was listing before are appropriate. And there are some really good ones there. I actually included in the chat, I don't know if you guys had a chance to see, but the City of Lancaster has a really great bicycle and pedestrian program called CMD Scene, and they used an OTS grant to start that. So I would encourage you guys to check out that website and see what you might want to borrow in the City of Santa Maria, because it's a really, really successful and very good program. Next slide. So this is where we'd like to turn it over into a more interactive meeting. This is kind of the end of the listening to us blather on part of it. But we have the 3 core emphasis areas: vulnerable users, risky behaviors, and intersections. And then within that, we have the bicycles, pedestrians, and seniors as vulnerable users. They receive the brunt of the injury when they're involved in crashes. Risky behaviors, impaired driving, distracted driving, those are major focus areas at the statewide level and are pretty significant in Santa Maria itself. And before you say, what are we going to do with that? That's driver's behavior. The city can't do anything. That's actually not true. There are quite a number of interventions that can help with that. You can't necessarily engineer away somebody's behavior, but you can potentially reduce the harm of it, and you can potentially make it a little more difficult. And then intersections. So this is a pretty broad one, and basically anything that we want to do at an intersection counts under here. And we've got these identified hotspot corridors, but any intervention that we would propose here could be implemented at other signalized intersections or other unsignalized intersections as well as appropriate as part of those systemic approaches. So what I was hoping to do is start maybe working our way through these. And I've seen a lot of notes in chats already, which is great, about what kind of interventions you guys would like to see us focus on in the toolbox when it comes to these specific things. And I know we have a lot of folks on here for the bicycles and pedestrians, so maybe we can start there and talk about it, because I've seen some things about focusing on the protected bike lanes versus the standard bike lane and other things like that. So this is a great time to start having those discussions. So if anybody wants to throw things in chat or put your hand up and kick it off, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Well, Daryl, as Heather said, the bicycling community here has been in blackout as to what Caltrans has planned to do on Broadway. So this is one of our major hot corridors, and there's some things being done now. We don't know what else we want to be done.
Well, I guess getting to that, so the single ramp versus the double ramp example for ADA ramps. One thing an LRSP can do is we don't necessarily have to say we're going to go to this intersection and blow up the ramp and create it new. We could also have, as an LRSP and mitigation factor, have city update design standards. So moving forward, this is the preferred configuration, or we could say there's lots of different levels we can come in at the LRSP as part of the toolbox, because it's supposed to be very forward-looking.
And I'll just add that. Always, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You could always contact our public information officer for questions regarding the project that's going to be going on 135. But just in generality, we are where we could fit bike lanes in, we're putting them in. And where we couldn't fit bike lanes in, we're putting in shared markings. So I think you'll be really happy with what we're doing out there. But again, there were constraints with right of way and stuff. So there are some blocks that we just couldn't do anything, but we're actually putting a fair amount of bike lanes in there. So I'm super excited about what we're doing there.
Yeah, and I'll just add, depending on the HSIP applications that are ultimately developed, if they do include locations within the state right of way, obviously those HSIP applications will be coordinated with Caltrans. So anything that is included as part of those HSIP applications, obviously we'll need to to have the support of Caltrans.
Right. My point is that it's hard for us to make suggestions as to interventions now because we don't know what's being done on Highway 135. We have been asking for several months for plans, something to know what's actually being done. And we have not been given that. We have been in contact with Jim Silvers and with the engineer, Barack Miles, I think it is. And what they have told us is that, yes, we can have the plans. We have to submit a form to request the plans, and we will receive the plans when the plans are complete. The plans aren't complete, and they won't be complete until the project is complete, until everything is done. Apparently there will be as-built plans. So we really don't know what's being done.
Well, I guess I understand that constraint, and that sounds like it's probably a little bit frustrating. But the idea here, we want to be pretty forward-looking. So that sounds like that project's pretty well underway, and we may not be able to influence that significantly with this plan. But if you were to aspirationally say, what would you like to see? Maybe this is further out, or maybe it's on different corridors than Broadway. But is there a specific design thing or specific types of barriers that you would like to remove, anything like that, and we can get that looked at as part of our toolbox?
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. Again, we took the city's active transportation plan and incorporated the fairly comprehensive safety analysis that was included as part of that as well. So the good news is that this LRSP reflects all the recommendations and findings and data that was used as part of the ATP. So, that's just a good thing to know that this plan is reflective of the efforts that were performed as part of the active transportation plan. Again, I would just hearken on what was said, is that reach out to the public information officer at Caltrans. And there's not much we can do as part of this effort to help shine some light on that, but we totally understand the frustration.
Well, one of the things that seems to me to be important in this process at this point is to really identify if we're looking at all of these things together, vulnerable users, risky behaviors, and intersections, is what are the cheapest things that can be done that would address all of those? Because it seems to me that all of this involves slowing down cars so that any impaired driving, any distracted driving is less of a problem, slowing down vehicles so that pedestrians, bicyclists, and seniors, if they are hit, they're not hit at as high a speed, and the points of conflict are the intersections. So what, on your previous slides where you showed what things ranked the best in terms of how much benefit they did versus the cost, it would be pretty much starting from the top of that list and building those priorities. But without knowing off the top of my head what those priorities are, I couldn't say, yeah, do that.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good point, Jim, if you want to go to 29.
Yeah. And I'll just add, the emphasis areas are really the holistic big picture of what you were saying. You were mentioning benefit cost. So what we're showing is, the either in absolute terms or as a rate, the locations that, based on the data we have used, indicate an issue. But I will say, this whole grant application process, that does get into benefit cost. And benefit cost is the key metric, not only at the statewide level, but at the federal level as well. we call them low-cost countermeasures, but we don't do any costing as part of this. That will be in the HSIP applications. And we do need to have a competitive benefit cost. It's kind of the game within the game, right? And so the plan provides that holistic approach through the emphasis areas, and you'll see that in the last chapters. But in terms of where we're focusing our energies from this point on is getting prepped for those HSIP applications, which has other factors built in, just given the nature of the programs themselves that we have to focus on. So we're not suggesting that we're solving everything as part of this round of HSIP, as Mark pointed out, and as Daryl and I. This is supposed to be a resource for future cycles of HSIP, other funding programs, so on and so forth. So we're hoping that the life of this plan provides a lot of traction for allowing the city to seek and actually get awarded outside funding from the state or feds to bring into the city to make these improvements. But it's going to have to be, those incremental steps towards funding.
So if it's helpful, I can talk a little bit about what some of the other cities have chosen to do with their LRSPs and with their implementation programs to address some of the emphasis areas you have. Like one that seems to come up a lot is speed. So how do we reduce speed? And to be honest, speed limits are a pretty blunt force way to handle it and not necessarily entirely successful because people drive the way the road is designed. And what you put on a sign doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on that. And the ability to enforce that speed limit can also be impacted if that speed limit is too different from the way people are driving on that roadway, as we all know. Even with AB 43, that's probably going to continue to be the case to a certain degree. But one of the things that cities have been really successful with their HSIP is signal modernization. So being able to upgrade all your signal equipment, use your timing programs to make a green wave that goes at the speed you want so that if people are driving too fast, they're just going to get stopped at every intersection. Also new detection systems. One of the popular ones is called advanced dilemma zone detection. And that allows the signal to respond to the traffic that's coming. So if there's a car approaching the signal at a speed where if the light turns yellow, that car may or may not stop because of that decision making the driver has to do or the dilemma. And then the car behind that car might also have to make that dilemma. The first one stops, the second one doesn't, you get the rear end crash. So that system would let the signal decide, maybe I should hold that just a couple seconds longer for that yellow so that we don't create that dilemma problem and we avoid that rear end crash. Another part of that one would be leading pedestrian interval. So a lot of pedestrians get hit by right turning cars when they're trying to just start crossing the road because they get their walk signal, they go, the car turns right, they get hit. So the leading pedestrian interval lets the pedestrian have their walk signal before the green signal for the through traffic. So the pedestrian's well in the crosswalk, very visible before those right turning vehicles get started. So there's a number of those types of improvements. There's also the physical stuff, making your signal heads bigger, more visible, adding the yellow reflective backplates that I was mentioning. Some of those are fairly low cost things and some of them are a little bit higher cost things. But when you're doing those systemic implementations, you can get pretty large grants to do those modernizations and still have a really nice benefit cost ratio because you're impacting such a large proportion of your crashes when you do it. And those can actually have a pretty good impact on all of those things. You can reduce the speeds, you can reduce the likelihood that an impaired or distracted driver creates a crash because there's just a little bit more flex in the system. You can make it a little bit easier for the bicycles and pedestrians to navigate safely because you're reducing some of those conflicts. So it's not a big glamorous project where you're creating this new complete street, but you are making a real change to how your streets operate. So that's one example. Another one would be doing some bicycle lanes or protected bike lanes in a more systemic way. So you identify what corridors those have the most demand and you put them in there. Another one is identifying where you might have a lot of pedestrian crossings where there is a challenge there, because one of the comments earlier was, should we put more marked crosswalks where there are legally crosswalks so that people know and raise driver awareness? there's a lot of hesitancy on most agencies to do that when the road's above a certain speed limit or a certain number of lanes, because you're creating a situation now where you're giving the pedestrian a much better sense of security than they might actually have, because the painted lines don't necessarily stop the drivers the way you might want them to. So if you want to make it safer, you add signals of some kind. You put the hawk or the hybrid beacon or something like that in. And those are what I was talking about, can be often a set aside with HSIP, where you don't even need a benefit cost. You can put those kind of things in and get pretty good money to build that type of stuff through this program. So I'd say those are probably some of the most popular things and that had some of the most high success rates of getting funded last round. But there's a lot of other stuff. If you've got those left turns that just have the green ball where you have to kind of wait for the gap in traffic to make your left turn, versus the ones with the green and red arrows, so you get your own phase to do those left turns. That's another one that can be implemented. So there's a lot of stuff like that when we're talking about the signalized intersections. And if you kind of look down this list, those are all here. Some of those raised pavement markings to make a little bit more noise when people stray out of their lanes is another one. Pedestrian fencing, if you have mid-block crossing where you really can't have it and it's causing a problem, is another one that gets in there. Putting pedestrian countdown heads. I don't know if there's anywhere in the city where you're still missing those, but that's a pretty easy one to get funded if you need things like that. If you have really high pedestrian intersections, pedestrian scrambles, that can be something. There's been some interesting implementation of that, especially near high schools. If you've got that are only active during the school pickup and drop off time, so that you're completely separating the students from the vehicular traffic, they get their own crossing phase. So there's a bunch more, bunch of stuff there.
Yeah,
and I guess
I'll just add to. Oh, am I on mute? No. Can you hear me? Yeah, and this is the plan. We didn't show this information, but we did look at geography as well. So we looked at proximity to schools, proximity to parks, and proximity to senior facilities. And we looked at within 2 or 3 blocks, and then outside of that where pedestrian or bicycle collisions occurred. So those sensitive, vulnerable users. So all that analysis, which is very important, is also in the plan. We just didn't present those findings, but those things are very important and can help inform where we should focus a grant application. But so that was just another layer of analysis that should be considered as we tie everything together.
I don't know, Jim, if you want to jump down to the unsignalized, and we can sort of talk about what's in there. So when we don't have a signal and we're working with intersections that are just either side stop controlled or all-way controlled, here we have things we can do, like putting some of the LED stop signs in. There's some very inexpensive things, just putting some reflective markers around the poles if you're having people hit those. We can do some sight distance modifications, maybe if that requires a bit of vegetation clearance or a bit of grading or things like that. Flashing beacons. I'm sure you've all seen the overhead red flasher over a stop sign if you have some challenges there, maybe especially in more rural places where the lighting isn't as good. Splitter islands is another one. And then we can also we can add turning lanes if that's needed for acceleration, deceleration, or alternatively, we can remove them and tighten turn radiuses if we're worried about the speed and conflicts with bikes and pedestrians. And then down at the bottom, we have those beacons I was talking about, the hybrid beacons or the hawk signals, can put in things like that. Also pedestrian refuge islands, conversions to yield control. There's also opportunities to do things like change the intersection entirely, turn it into a roundabout or something like that, if that's more appropriate for a particular type of area. So
yeah, and as you all know, a big issue within the city is just the sheer width of your right-of-way of your local streets, as well as on Main and Broadway, but on local streets, you have very wide streets. And so that crossing distance makes it even more of a challenge for pedestrians. I think there's some low hanging fruit to reducing crossing lengths and providing treatments to make folks crossings more visible and make the drivers more aware of the presence of pedestrians. So we'll go to roadway.
Yeah, for the roadway segments, there's a lot of different things here. Intersections is really the emphasis area for Santa Maria, but there are definitely occasions where it's appropriate to add more lighting. If you have long segments near the fringe of the city that are just really dark, you might consider that. If it's a higher speed roadway section, trying to make the recovery zone a little bit more. If you go to the second page, that's where we get more into the urban stuff. So we have some more bicycle and pedestrian things that we can do down there, where it's adding the bicycle lanes and raised pedestrian crossings or raised intersections, making the crossings a little bit easier, filling in gaps in the sidewalk system or improving the ADA access. The separated bike lanes is one of the countermeasures that we have in here. That actually is a little bit better ranked than just this plain bike lane. You get about an extra 10%, and it's got the same amount of funding associated with it. And then just a little bit more warning signage. That's another big factor here. If you need signal ahead signs, or if you need any changes where you have any curves in the roadway sections or whatever, signs and markings and striping and all that other stuff is available here. We can do any of that.
Yeah, Mark, I have a question. Just given the funding eligibility for HSIP, there may be a need for a local match. I'm assuming Measure A funding is available for that.
Yeah, Eric might have to chime in, but I think we put in some CMEPs, so budgeted money for a local match. So not sure how much, but I know that was one of my requests when we were talking about starting budget for the cycle. So.
Great.
So yeah, just a reminder, this grant is expected to come out in April. So the city would want to submit up to, I guess we're talking about 3 applications here. There's different ways we can format that as well. So I don't know if you guys want to hear about the strategy that goes into HSIP. There's a lot of it. But minimizing the local match is one component of that strategy. Maximizing your competitiveness, like getting those benefit cost ratios, not so high that you're leaving benefit money on the table, but high enough that you're going to be very well clear. And then there's another one, Dan, I don't know if this is something you can speak to, but there's also the encouragement to do stretch goals. Caltrans likes to see really ambitious systemic grants. So let's say we do one of those signal modernizations. You submit a grant to just completely upgrade the whole city, and maybe that has a borderline benefit cost ratio. You're not sure if that'll get funded or not. So rather than not submit that and do an all or nothing, you can submit a second grant for the same thing that's maybe doing 75% of the city where the highest crashes are. So your benefit cost ratio is higher. So if you don't get that funding for the grant for everything, you can at least get that 75%. And then you've kind of guaranteed that you get something but you still have the ability to potentially get everything. So that's another option.
And that's driven by the right, and that gets really strategic, and so you would be basing your 75% of the city based on where that sweet spot is with the benefit cost, because you want to keep that fairly competitive. And the trend that we've seen over many cycles, this will be cycle 11, but in cycle 10, 9, 8, 7, the benefit cost cut lines have been creeping up. In other words, anybody has a benefit cost of less than X is not going to make the list. And so that cut line has been getting more and more rigid, I would say, or
Yeah, and
more
safety programs have very, very high benefit cost ratios relative to other grant programs. Like you're going for a big federal highway grant, you might need a benefit cost of 2 or 3, so 2 times the return on investment from the grant. A safety grant for HSIP, sometimes you need up to 10 or 12. So that if you spend $100,000, you need $1 million of benefit. And that's partly because safety costs are so high. So the benefits accumulate really fast, and that's what you're competing with. So there's only so much money in the program. The other applicants are putting in these really big benefit costs. So that's what these floors end up being. The program says you have to have 3.5 minimum to even submit the grant, but the last few cycles, it's been a very, very high number that has come in as the cutoff.
I'm looking at the chat. Jeffrey's had a couple comments in here about, bulb outs and then no right on red lights. I guess, Jeffrey, do you have any like specific areas where you want to see those implemented? Just this is the kind of our opportunity to spitball and identify those locations, or what you guys want to see. Obviously you can send comments after, but it's nice to have it while Jim and Daryl are here.
So I don't want to get too far out there, but intersection specific no right on red policy doesn't always seem to work. I mean, we have that at a few places in Santa Maria, for instance, at Battles and Miller, and because we have our multi-use path next there, and but it's not always, doesn't always work. So what about like something like a citywide policy, Santa Maria no right on red, like New York City has? So I understand that a no right on red policy greatly improves the safety for pedestrians. In places they've had a tremendous reduction in collisions and injuries. So that's just one thing that I'd heard about it. I'm really hesitant to put it out because it seemed like it'd be a really big change to say, hey, no right on red in Santa Maria, but it could make a big difference to people who walk.
That's definitely the kind of thing that can be considered. The only thing I would suggest we'd want to think about with that is compliance and how well would it just frustrate people and then create a new problem. So it needs to be coupled, something like that would need to be coupled with a very aggressive education and enforcement component to it. And sometimes that can create different challenges associated with it, but there's certainly no reason that it couldn't be explored.
Yeah, I would say just to build on that part, Daryl, if we were going to move forward with something like that, I would definitely want to have some, public meetings other than just this group, because
of course,
get in front of any potential negative or not. There again, it's something that we'd probably have to get like city council to approve, because that's a pretty big change, and you're especially if someone's going to get ticketed for it, I think technically it has to be approved by city council. So
there's also the challenge of consistency with your neighboring jurisdictions and all that. Like New York City is a massive place and is kind of very well and distinct. Like if it was more of a countywide or a regional implementation that in urban areas where people get used to it, that's a lot easier to make that work than it is like if Gonzales isn't doing it and you guys are, or am I getting myself mixed up?
Guadalupe.
Guadalupe, thank you. Sorry, I'm myself mixed up. Your neighboring cities, if they're not doing it, that can kind of create some challenges too, because people don't know where the borders of the cities are. That's just not part of the way people think.
Certainly it would take education and some thought into timeline for implementing. But one thing about riding bicycles and walking in Santa Maria is there's a particular culture about Santa Maria. I mean, if you go to San Luis Obispo just north of us, or Santa Barbara just south of us, there is a lot more bicycle infrastructure, and people ride their bicycles on the street. But I ride my bike to work most every day. And one of my colleagues at my workplace asked me one day, Jeffrey, why don't you ride your bicycle on the sidewalk? Like, the culture for bicycle riding in Santa Maria is that, hey, your bikes don't belong on the street. So if we're looking at, if we wanted to implement something like no ride on red, which would have a significant impact on safety, we're looking at like changing the culture of transportation in Santa Maria, which I think really needs to happen to significantly reduce the amount of collisions. So like you're talking about enforcement of something like this. Well, you would want to do some enforcement, but if it was a part of the culture, a part of the training, hey, we're in Santa Maria, we don't do rights on reds, you know, then it would have a greater chance of success. And even if you got 80 or 90% compliance, I think that you'd still be saving some lives and preventing some serious injuries.
Yeah, it's complicated, Jeffrey. I mean, besides enforcement side, you know, by reducing or precluding right turn on reds, it's an operational issue as well. So many intersections that perform as well as they do in terms of moving traffic through the intersection, particularly during the peak hours, often rely on those right turn on reds because they're non-conflicting movements that occur when other movements are being made without conflict with other vehicles. So that would be something the city would have to weigh in on, is that how much are we compromising or sacrificing in terms of overall delay that is occurring at the intersections. Particularly, it could be a tough sell if the intersections are not high pedestrian, don't have a lot of high pedestrian traffic. So you're delaying vehicles from turning red or turning right on red when there's no conflicting movements, and yet when they don't see any pedestrians there, it's hard for them to, you know, grapple with that kind of restriction. So it's citywide. I kind of agree with you. That's more of a you know, let's make this a blanket type policy, but there's reasons why it's done at specific locations, because it really has to be justified by that pedestrian volume and pedestrian crossing. And you can argue, well, there's not pedestrians there because it's so treacherous to navigate that intersection as a pedestrian. Totally get that. So it's tough, but it's a good suggestion. I do want you to talk about bulb outs, though, if there was any, because we've talked about how, you know, wide the city streets are in Santa Maria. Bulb outs is one, as well as pedestrian refuge areas, these kind of things that allow a two-stage crossing or at least a shorter length to walk across the street. Are there any specific locations with respect to bulb outs that, or was that more like a citywide application as well?
Well, I had not any particular intersections in mind, but you were talking about adding things to the toolbox, and that was one thing that came to mind that would help reduce crossing distances.
Yeah, I agree.
And just sort of getting to your point, Jeffrey, about the presence of bikes on the road and making them a more recognized and legitimate part of traffic and in the way people understand and how they operate. There's a lot of other things that we can do as well to help reinforce that. So that's kind of what we do with the green paint when we have conflict zones in the bike lanes, bike boxes, those leading pedestrian intervals that I was talking about earlier. Those are all strategies that can do some of what you were talking about as well, and maybe a little bit more integrate even the cyclists into the regular traffic flow as part of the roadway users and get people used to seeing them more and hopefully increase the amount of them out there, because that's the biggest factor. is if you don't have a lot of people on bikes and drivers aren't seeing them every day, they get kind of forgotten about and just become annoying when they see them, as opposed to, okay, this is the experience we have in Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, and all that. And you can't do that until you've built the infrastructure and make people feel safe doing it.
I'd like to add support to the bulb out comment, because to me, it seems like a way to control speed at intersections, particularly intersections where we have street parking on both sides. It seems like to not have that street parking for the last few feet before the crosswalk, or before where a pedestrian would be crossing, and to have a bulb out. Normally the pedestrian needs to get out to the front edge of those parked cars to be able to see traffic anyway. On a bicycle, even in a car, it's very similar. And additionally, it would create that visual situation that a car driver is experiencing, where the intersection itself appears to be more of a risk to the car driver, and so they may slow down. You know, we talked about speed limits and how they're not easy to change, and they're expensive to enforce, and they're not always adhered to. It's more the conditions on the road. So any kind of work like bulb outs, like additional markings, like raised surfaces at these intersections that are mentioned along, particularly I think of Miller, because it's not Broadway and Main, it's not a Caltrans controlled street that takes a little more coordination, a little more work. Miller is one like that. College is another, particularly near Allen Hancock College, where some crossings could be improved because the road is incredibly wide. There's a stretch along the college where we have a center line and 2 lanes and parking, and it's got to be well over 50 or 60 feet wide along there. At least it gives you that impression. And so the whole combination of road diets and improvements at the intersections would really help. The other road in particular that I know the city has done some work on already that I think has been very effective is Alvin Street. It's an east-west crossing, and there's been a road diet on the western edge of it. And that's a particular street of real importance as you head east, because it is one of only 2 crossings of the 101 freeway that does not have an interchange. And so Alvin is very important for students moving from to the high school district, the high school that students attend. The students on the west side of town attend a high school on the far east side of town, and the only crossing of 101 that's not affected by an interchange is Alvin Street. And right now it's a 4-lane road, really wide. It has parking along most of it on the eastern side of town. And the idea of bulb outs, any kind of better identification for intersections and crosswalks, and a road diet in that section would be really valuable, as would the North-South Street College that I'd mentioned. Miller is a particular problem when it hits Alvin, because we go from really old neighborhoods that have narrow streets, and then the street widens. But that intersection, I know at Miller and Alvin, was one that had been mentioned for accident numbers, and that would benefit from road diets coming into it, I think, and the bulb out idea to shorten those pedestrian crossings. So I think any of those ideas could be applied systemically, particularly the bulb outs wherever we have parking, because it makes that site for bicyclists and pedestrians better, and may help slow cars down as they approach the intersections. But Alvin, Miller, and College are streets that would particularly benefit from those types of things. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. So on the visibility at the intersections and the parking, I don't know if Santa Maria would be interested in considering something like what the city of Seattle does, where they actually have a citywide ordinance prohibiting parking within a certain distance of a stop sign. That's actually pretty commonplace in a lot of places as well. Not so much in California, although I wish it would be, because it's a nice way to get that low cost incremental version. So you establish that no parking zone, and then when you build the bulb out, you're not having all the pitchforks and things out at you for taking away their parking spot. So it can be a nice two-phase process.
Yeah, I'll have to do some research on that one if there's any that's palatable, because I mean that's going to be a I mean, the enforcement part is hard. We have hard enough time getting people to not park in front of a fire hydrant. And I get calls all the time of, hey, can you come, paint this, paint it red in front of this fire hydrant? Like, dude, we have thousands of fire hydrants. We're not painting in front of every fire hydrant. So I could see that being an issue of, well, I didn't know I couldn't, park in front of this or at this corner. So I'll have to do some research. But Ken, you had your hand up for a long time.
No worries. I was just going to reiterate, guys, focusing on the bulb outs around schools was the main thing, just to obviously create safety for students there. And then particularly, obviously it's Caltrans, but Broadway and Main and Broadway and Cook, obviously, to increase public engagement and commerce for the downtown area. But yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else that would be helpful for the bulb outs. And yeah, I think they pretty much covered it. Yeah, thanks.
Also wanted to note, wasn't necessarily a part of the active transportation plan or the CMEP to resurface Broadway, but Caltrans did get a Clean California grant to do some improvements on Broadway between Main and Cook. So I think part of it's going to be some landscaping stuff. I haven't seen any of the conceptuals yet. I know we had a field meeting with a landscape architect last week, so I don't know where that is in the process, but my understanding is they're putting together some conceptual plans. So also forward that to you guys, because I know that part of the city's desire is to revitalize downtown, and there's proposed developments to go in downtown. So it'll be nice to reduce the roadway width on Broadway, have more on-street parking if that's possible whenever that does happen. So just heads up.
And what kind of improvements can that fund, Mark? You mentioned landscaping.
Yeah, I know they're going to look at like beautification of the actual corners. So if when they get there for the curb ramp project, they want to see if they can do some kind of decorative, either concrete. I don't know if that necessarily means stamped or not, or colored. But I know we were talking about like there's landscaping that's either missing, or the stuff in the medians is different than elsewhere in the city. So they're talking about making that consistent. So a lot of beautification stuff, I think, is what they're looking at, not necessarily adding in crosswalk or adding in a mid-block crossing or something like that. But I know that's been considered.
Can it fund an ADA treatment?
I think so.
Okay, nice. Okay, well, we're almost out of time, and I thought it was a great discussion. We heard a lot of good things. We're going to, the draft is there. It's not perfect. We're going to be refining it. So we welcome your comments and suggestions. As Mark indicated, we're hoping to wrap up all comments by February 11th. So the consultant team can address the comments as applicable and get a final draft prepared for eventual inclusion in the council packet for March. So with that, again, I'll remind everyone that this was recorded. We'll go ahead and include the presentation on the website. And to respond to that one question, we'll let and follow up with the entire group of the Stakeholder Advisory Group to let them know that they can view the discussion and provide comments as well. So, but we do appreciate you guys participating in this. It's always better to have you at the meetings. And again, it was great discussion. I'll just pass it back to Mark for any final words.
Yeah, just final parting comments is if you think of something, it's a project, we're still in the conceptual phase of what we're going to apply for the HSIP grants. So it's not like this past 30 minutes is your only chance to provide input. If you think of something, especially after reviewing the document, that it'd be helpful for us. Also want to make sure, we're providing projects that people actually want to use and see, and, they feel involved in the process, because you guys are important, and, want to make sure that your voices are heard when we're applying for these projects, because it's not just me and, deciding how the city's going to do this. So we appreciate your time and efforts.
No, I'll just trumpet that. So I'm really glad you brought that up, Mark. We, as you could probably tell, we have not formulated our HSIP applications yet. That's the next step. So any comments or suggestions related to what we should focus on for those 3 grant applications in terms of safety improvements, we're all ears. So we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thank
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.